The room kept a damp, breathless hush as the clock struck, and Alin Varga felt the air in the chamber thicken with the weight of decision. Snow slid down the window like gull feathers, and the lamp above the table hissed faintly, as if a tired beast waking for a fight. The draught from the corridor carried the sour tang of tobacco and ink, and the leather of the chairs moaned a little when someone shifted. In medias res the moment stretched. A pen hovered in the hand of a negotiator from Berlin. A seal waited on a parchment edge, and all around voices rose and fell like distant tides, only to hush again when the presiding minister cleared his throat. Alin did not belong at the center of this room, not really. She belonged to the margins, the careful margins where the margins become the map of a lifeth lull of a desk job, the tremor of a decision that would ripple beyond the saloons into workrooms and kitchens, into the wires that fed the factories and the schools that fed the minds of the next generation. But tonight she stood where the light did more than illuminate ink. It gathered the breath of futures and pressed it into one thin line. The Vienna peace, if it could be coaxed into being, would not end wars so much as transform them into paperwork, reorganized by federations rather than fanatical. Sovereignty. On the wall, a map bloomed in archival greens and sepias, a relic of a time when borders had bled into blood. Now the lines of those borders bent and softened, colored threads running through the chalk and varnish, stitching three great cloths of power into a single quilt. The map spoke in a language she could feel as much as read. Three federations would cradle a world that once scattered nations across the globe's shoulders like coins tossed into a well. The Anglo-Atlantic Federation, the Continental Federation, the Eastern Coalition. The terms lay on the parchment like a verdict spoken softly enough to be believed, unfair enough to be feared. A murmur rose from the far end of the table, the voice of a delegate who believed that to preserve order was to murder the promise of self-rule. He argued with the stubborn patience of a man who had watched empires survive hunger and revolution by choosing distance over memory. He argued that the colonies would resent federated status, that to bind them to the metropoles would delay growth, like planting saplings into a frozen ground and calling it preservation. But the counterpoint came in a whisper from another chair, a woman whose name Alin could not recall in that instant, for names were the first casualty of a moment when nations trembled into a new shape. A federation, but also a shared destiny, a compromise she could scarcely believe until it was. Spoken aloud, Alin's own thoughts moved closer to the risk, closer to the tremor of a map taking breath and choosing a new geometry. As if they signed this, she knew, the daily life of millions would bend around a new rhythm, not the raw tempo of conquest or the clamor of upheaval, but a patient, stubborn cadence of federation law. It's in the small hours of a morning that would never be long enough for every grievance, people would wake to the sense that their great-grandfathers' dreams of nationhood had collided with a different necessity: stability, predictability, a world in which a clerk in a factory town in Bohemia could plan for the next decade rather than live by the next tide of rumor. The price, she thought, would be quiet. The cost would be the long, slow wind down of old loyalties and the slow, careful build of new loyalties to a larger order. Her imagination snagged on a slice of daily life she could almost touch. A worker in Ostrava, bending over a lathe, her hands stained with oil and rust, listening to a radio that murmured about a three-federation future in words she could barely parse, yet the future's gravity reached out and pulled her to it, a mother in tryst counting the coins in her purse and feeding her children a fragment of bread, listening to the same broadcast and feeling the promise as a weight in her chest, heavy, necessary, terrifying. A student in Berlin tracing the map on the classroom wall with an upturned finger, tracing each line as if the borders themselves were lines of care, lines of future responsibility she would inherit whether she liked it or not. The quiet break did not arrive with a shout. It drifted in like a winter fog, seeping under the door and through the thick glass, until it rested on the table and the parchment glowed with a pale certainty. The Chancellor's hand, which had trembled only in moments of doubt, settled as if at long last it had found a hinge and could stop wobbling. The sprig of lavender pinned to his lapel, so faint a scent, but a deliberate, almost ceremonial touch spoke of old-world rituals, of dinners and decisions made after long nights of wine and argument. He spoke, and his voice, steady with the gravity of what might become history, offered the simplest, most devastating line: "We choose to preserve the federations rather than cast them aside in a burst of misguided pride." And with those words the room exhaled and time stretched thin. The draft came with a final flourish, and the ink, glossy, black, certain kissed the parchment like a vow. Elin watched the signature slow into place, the seal pressed with the methodic weight of a law that would outlive the moment's fever. The quiet break was not a scream but a hinge, and the door between the old world and the new world swung, not with fanfare, but with the soft click of a mechanism engaging. When the first line of the map brightened under the projector's beamed, color-coded counties of the Anglo-Atlantic Federation to the west, and the continental and eastern clusters pressing toward the east, Elin felt the room tilt, not in fear but in consequence. The old order, with its stubborn, iron routines, would have to do without the moral luxury of perpetual upheaval. The new order, three federations, would demand a different kind of leadership, a leadership that could hold not just a continent together but a plurality of voices within each federation, a mosaic of languages, religions, and urban climates that would now have to be spoken in a common legal tongue. As the delegates turned to one another, a routine of polite compromise began. A nod here, a half-smile there, a recognition that no single nation had the right to presume its own story would be the world's only true story. Elin felt the room's tension migrate toward a surprising quietude, as if the air itself had learned a new grammar and was teaching it to everyone present. The question that gnawed at her, the question that was not spoken aloud, sat in the corners of the room like a patient patient. If the colonies gain federated status within their metropoles, does that not postpone the day when self-determination becomes an absolute demand rather than a possible? A compromise, and if the answer is yes, then what does that mean for the future's children, who would grow up under a system that promised stability but risked leaving them voiceless in a chorus of larger voices? Her attention drifted, almost against her will, to the glass case near the door where a small, battered clock rested. It had survived several regimes, survived the loud pages of history turned at hastily convened councils, survived the silent, patient work of those who kept the gears oiled in the back rooms of power. The clock's hands crawled forward as the signatures dried. Each minute a reminder that time itself was a negotiator, that history often moved not with the force of a cannon, but with the quiet, stubborn drag of a compromise that would endure long after the immediate conflict had faded into memory. And then there was the afterimageth memory of the future, as if someone had turned on archival footage and then let it drift into modern CGI. The old black and white reels of parliamentary debates, now dissolving into a luminous panorama of a three-federation world. The map on the wall shifted in the projector's glow, borders curling into diagrams of shared governance, interlinked rail lines, and education systems that trained children to navigate not a single nation's destiny, but a federated destiny. It was a vision both dazzling and chilling, as if a city built to stand against a storm would also be a city built to weather the quiet, constant weather of compromise. Outside, the air carried the metallic tang of winter and the suggestion of rain catching in the eaves. The people on the street, shopkeepers closing their doors, soldiers marching with their boots clicking on the cobblestones, women drawing their shawls tighter around their shoulders carried the same breath of the moment. If the Vienna peace would hold, it would hold because the people believed in the practicality of a new order as much as they feared its remnants. The newspapers would print lists of guarantees, the radio broadcasts would chant phrases of federation and shared budgets, and in the working neighborhoods, the daily life of workers would begin to adjust to a timetable measured by industrial cycles rather than by the unpredictable tempo of nation-state politics. Elin stepped back from the table and felt the pressure in her temples ease into a strange, resolute calm. The night's events would not define her, not in a singular moment of triumph or terror, but through the small, unglamorous acts that followed. The clerks tallying the already daunting sums of colonial budgets, the engineers sketching the first drafts of shared space programs, the teachers rehearsing a new multilingual curriculum to be implemented across federated cities. The quiet break would be felt in every corridor, in every factory hall and classroom, in every kitchen and warehouse where people learned to live with the knowledge that they were part of a system larger than themselves. a system that could endure both tyranny and terror if it could also learn to regulate itself. In the end, as the room settled into a respectful stillness, and the first signs of sleep began to press at the edges of the chamber windows, Elin understood that the story wasn't only about a single decision, but about a direction chosen in a moment of dangerous candor. The decision to preserve the Austro-Hungarian and German empires as federations would reframe borders, yes, but it would also refract daily life through a long lens that would reveal a world capable of sustaining three great federations, a world where colonies learned the art of shared governance and where heavy industry and space programs would be funded not by conquest but by cross-border budgets and long-range mutual obligation. Outside, the first stars flickered, and the city exhaled its own quiet sigh. The map on the wall, once a document of lines and claim snow, looked back at her as a living forecast. A three-federation world, bordered not by the blunt edge of swords, but by the patient, stubborn geometry of cooperation. And Elin, who had come to hold the line between law and life, found in the night's stillness a singular, odd promise. That a single, quiet break could become a steady breath for generations, a world in which empires endured not through domination, but through a disciplined, shared responsibility for a future that might still be worth the cost of living in it. Error, all tokens failed. Status 500. Message failed. Error, all tokens failed. Status 500. Message failed. Error, all tokens failed. Status 500. Message failed. Error, all tokens failed. Status 500. Message failed.